To many Americans, the name Midleton is more associated with a princess, her sister, and a bottom, but to those familiar with Irish whiskey, it means something far removed from royal derrieres. I'm Barry Chandler. Welcome to episode 5 of Stories and Sips. I host whiskey tastings, shoot videos like this, and I share stories about Ireland and its incredible whiskies so that Ireland can become the world's #1 whiskey tourism destination. I'm converting one American at a time to the joys of our lovely liquid, and it's working. Here's a comment from Instagram today showing that I might be a small foe against the behemoths of Scotch and bourbon, but as the great Dalai Lama once said, if you think you're too small to make a difference, try sleeping with a mosquito. So on with the episode and let this mosquito tell you about the real Midleton. I'm not sipping a whiskey today, but I am going to sit beside it. And I am saving this one for a special occasion, but more about this later. Now, Midleton is a small farming town in East Cork. It's about a half-hour's drive from Cork City, and it's the unlikely epicenter for the world of Irish whiskey. Unlikely maybe in terms of its size, it's only got a population of about 12,000, and unlikely because of its humility or maybe the fact that it doesn't have any airs of superiority, but not unlikely when you consider its location. Built right on the Dungourney River, a great freshwater source, and within 100 miles of all the barley it needs, it actually has the perfect location to distill the world's most famous Irish whiskies. In fact, 90% of the Irish whiskies on the market today are either completely distilled in this small town or they use its grain whiskey in their blends. Brands you'll be familiar with like Jameson, Powers, Paddy, Redbreast, Green Spot, Yellow Spot, Tullamore Dew, they're all born in Midleton. Now, not that I'm biased or anything, but the best things always do come out of Cork, and that's a fact. Now, there was a time when Dublin produced far more whiskey than anywhere else in the country, between Powers, the 2 Jameson distilleries and George Rowe. But in the 1960s, Irish whiskey was really on its knees. The industry was really struggling. Scotch had long overtaken it worldwide in terms of sales, and the spicier, creamier pot-stilled whiskey that was so renowned in Ireland and that we were so well known for more than a century really wasn't what younger drinkers at the time were looking for. So in order to stave off takeovers from unwelcome Scottish distilleries, the 3 remaining distilleries in Ireland in the 1960s, Cork Distilleries Company, Powers and Jameson, all came together to form Irish Distillers. And Powers and Jameson then voted to close their distilleries in Dublin and consolidate production in Midleton, where there was plenty of room for expansion. So they set about building or planning a new distillery to be built alongside the old distillery in Midleton, which had been in operation since the early 1800s. And the new distillery opened in 1975, about 10 years after the formation of Irish Distillers. And then a year later, Powers and Jameson in Dublin, they actually closed their distilleries, so that apart from Bushmills, every drop of whiskey produced in Ireland came out of Midleton. And it stayed that way for about 20 years or so. Now, when they did consolidate production of whiskey in Midleton, most of the whiskies were actually reformulated completely. Now, I can't imagine what that must have been like at the time, but almost all the whiskies, Paddy, Powers, Jameson, they were pot-stilled whiskey made a certain way with malted and unmalted barley in those large signature copper stills that you're familiar with. But they changed the formula so that all of the whiskies became blended whiskies to appeal to a wider audience, and certainly an overseas audience not used to that spiciness and sometimes that the impact you get from a great pot-stilled whiskey. But in doing so, they probably took a lot of heat from lifelong whiskey drinkers in Ireland, but at the same time, they ensured the survival of the Irish whiskey industry. Now, single pot still whiskey is today making a comeback, a dramatic one in fact. The worldwide attention generated by Midleton's famous export Jameson has certainly trickled down to the other family members. Brands like Redbreast and Green Spot, Yellow Spot, and these whiskies are seeing a huge surge in demand worldwide. And of course, Midleton is the ancestral home of pot still whiskey. Now, while many whiskies were reformulated into blends back in the 1960s and 70s, the smart distillers in Midleton kept making pot still whiskey for the devoted few. And thankfully they did, because without their foresight, supply of aged pot still whiskey would have dried up a long time ago. In the 180-year history of the Midleton distillery, one name has been synonymous with Irish whiskey making, and that is Crockett. Barry Crockett, the master distiller at the distillery in Midleton, retired himself in 2013 after 47 years in the job. A job that he took over from his own father, Max Crockett, who was himself the master distiller before him. I would argue that no other two men have had a greater impact on whiskey in Ireland since John Jameson and John Power. And the fact that Barry Crockett was born in the distillery in the master distiller's cottage really only adds to the romance and the story that is, for me, such a fabled place. In the 1980s, when Irish whiskey sales were dwindling, Barry Crockett kept the copper stills going. He kept churning out pot still whiskey and storing it away in the warehouse, anticipating a return in demand one day. He certainly wasn't wrong. 1984, Barry Crockett launched the famous Midleton Very Rare series, which is what you see here. And that's a limited production blended whiskey of approximately 20 to 25-year-old whiskies, all from Midleton and selected by the master distiller. And a different blend has been released every year since. It was Midleton Very Rare that was my first introduction to the incredible history and taste of Irish whiskey. Now, working as a trainee manager in Adair Manor in Limerick, I was obsessed with everything hospitality, food and drink, and Midleton whiskey represented to me the very best of Irish whiskey. Now, it was 1997 and I was earning £68 a week as a trainee manager. But when I walked into T. Fox's in Galway and saw the bottle of Midleton glowing on the top shelf, I knew I had to have it. And I wasn't discouraged by the fact that it was going to cost me 20% of my weekly wage at the time. I'll never forget the bartender's smile as he poured the drink and uttered the immortal line as he pushed the glass towards me. "That'll be like a candlelit procession going down your throat," he said. And he was right. And 20 years later, my wife and I toasted our engagement and our wedding with a bottle of Midleton. And a bottle was a gift for my best man at the wedding as well. So suffice to say, this finest of Irish whiskey blends, this finest of Irish whiskey has long been a part of my life and will continue to be if I have anything to do with it. Now, I have fond memories of the town of Midleton from an early age too. I grew up 12 miles away in the town of Cove and remember going to Midleton to the co-op with my mother to do the shopping. And I've also got great memories of visiting the distillery with my dad and touring the grounds of the old distillery. And there certainly isn't a trip back to Ireland that doesn't involve a trip to the gift shop to see what lucky finds that I might uncover there on the gleaming shelves. The Midleton Distillery and Irish distillers are now owned by the French drinks giant Pernod Ricard, who rescued the company in the 1980s. And over the past few years, they've invested more than €100 million in modernising the plant and really ensuring that it continues to meet ever-increasing global demand for what we would call liquid sunshine coming out of Midleton and Cork. For the first time in more than 40 years, distilling is back again in the old Midleton distillery. In an experimental release, Midleton has created this collaboration between the old guard of the distillery, the master distiller and the blender and the master of whiskey science, and their apprentices. And so you've got now this release called Method and Madness, and it's a series that first released in 2016, and it's based on new formulas that are inspired by old recipes and old notebooks in the archives, but also has a foot fairly firmly planted into the future. You see, it's this vision, this foresight, this embracing of the unknown and the unpredictable that, to me, has ensured Midleton has remained a place of pilgrimage for whiskey lovers and the birthplace of some of the greatest exports to ever leave our little country. And it's on the shoulders of the giants of characters from Midleton that today's distillers stand. France might have the Eiffel Tower, but Ireland has the Midleton Distillery. So my American friends, I urge you, go to your local liquor store, buy yourself a nice bottle of whiskey from Midleton, gather a few friends around and share a few stories and sips. Isn't that what life is all about? And to Barry Crockett and to those before him and after him, to Midleton, Sláinte. This is from Midleton. This is from Midleton. This is also from Midleton. That's from Midleton. This is from Midleton. This is from Midleton. This is from Midleton. This is from Midleton. That's from Midleton. This is from Midleton. That's from Midleton. That's from Midleton. They're all from Midleton.